Hello YASA folks, wherever you might be in the world. My name is Alex, I am from the University of Canberra. I'm recording today on beautiful Ngunnawal country. It is a rainy day, so please forgive my lighting if it gets a bit funny, and please forgive the start of this video if it sort of stutters and is a bit choppy. It should even out in a moment. This is a quirk my recording software has decided that it loves to do at the most opportune moments. Most importantly though, today in this paper I'll be presenting some work from my recently submitted doctoral thesis, which examines non-binary representation in YA through the lens of mythology-inspired fantasy. Specifically today, I'm going to talk about an issue that can crop up when representing groups like non-binary people in fantasy or other speculative fiction. The idea of the non-human, non-binary character. This potentially dallies with a lot of negative conceptions, but I argue it's also potentially a very playful and valuable space for exploring gender identity outside the confines of contemporary realism. So, what am I talking about today exactly? The non-human, non-binary character is a specific stereotype under the more prominent trope of dehumanizing transgender identity by associating it with otherworldliness or monstrosity. This is clearly visible in a cinematic history of trans villains, as folks like Jack Halberstam and Julia Serrano have written about at length. And the imagery of trans monstrosity is also solidified in various more theoretical transphobic works. In the radical feminist text Gyne/Ecology, for instance, Mary Daly compares gender affirmation surgery to the artificiality and body horror of Frankenstein's monster, which alongside other complex reclamation efforts throughout the history of queer art, the idea and the imagery of trans as monstrous has been embraced by some over the years. In the introduction to the collection The Emergence of Trans from 2020, the editors call for a movement to, quote, reclaim this monstrosity as a source of possibility and determination, holding on joyously and stubbornly to the power that comes with strangeness and difference. These issues, perceptions, and conversations, and the way they appear in art and fiction, overlap onto the more specific subset of non-binary identity, but there are also unique problematics. So with that broader foundation recognised, it's this specific niche of narrative tropes that I'm going to explore today. So, where does the recurring image of the non-human non-binary character come from, and why is it a problem? A. MacDonald suggests that, quote, one condition for being considered human is adherence to one of two binary gender categories. Thus, non-binary people may be denied recognition as intrinsically human. Though discussing gender constructions in a different context here, Judith Butler also observes that, quote, the mark of gender appears to qualify bodies as human bodies. The moment in which an infant becomes humanized is when the question, is it a boy or a girl, is answered. And as Caitlin Saoirse O'Shea writes in a personal essay, I, Robot, dehumanization can quickly follow the inability to answer that question. It's not a boy, it's not a girl, it's a thing. So these writers draw this conclusion obviously from a socio-cultural context, but this is also something that filters into fiction and literature. Following from a greater pattern in which trans people are frequently portrayed as monstrous or strange and otherworldly, non-binary fictional characters are frequently portrayed as inhuman, associated with robots, aliens, shapeshifters, uncanny mutants or hybrid beings, or other post-human or non-human constructs with otherworldly bodies. When looking for examples of what we might now, with modern technology, class as non-binary characters in literature, many examples are to be found in speculative fiction. The genderless aliens in Ursula Le Guin's iconic sci-fi novel Left Hand of Darkness, for example, or the shape-shifting character The Fool, who goes by many different names and identities across the books, from Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderling saga. And arguably, if we consider Virginia Woolf's Orlando a piece of fantastic fiction and as an example of a prototypical genderqueer character, that qualifies as well. For contemporary examples, critics and people discussing this trope often point to characters such as the sentient celestial supercomputer Janet from Netflix's The Good Place, or to the alien gems from Steven Universe, or the shapeshifter Double Trouble from She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. Now, the critical and creative dialogue surrounding this historical trend, as I'm sure you can imagine, is complex. Looking to both those more classic and more modern examples, many non-binary critics call for fictional representation beyond this non-human model that has become familiar across the identity's relatively limited pop culture history. Lamari and Greenhill point out that this trope often, quote, serves only to reinforce binaries by making the non-binary character exceptional and noting their unconventionality. Fenn Kennedy adds that establishing non-binary characters as alien, quote, allows their gender to be dismissed as alien too, i.e. something that no ordinary human could aspire to, something only for supernatural or strange creatures. Writing specifically about the case of Janet, author A.E. Osworth, quote, longs for characters who fall somewhere outside the gender binary simply because they do, who are gloriously, blessedly human and still defy the contextual categories of the society that has raised them. Such characters are few and far between. Now, the issue here lies in the fact that, to quote Alok Vaidmanon, the activist, at a fundamental level, non-binary people are still having to argue for the very ability to exist. And so, limiting their representation to constructed beings or non-human entities undermines the validity of non-binary gender in a way that many non-binary audience members understandably find frustrating. At the same time, however, many feel an affinity with these otherworldly characters and celebrate their sense of connection, including some of the authors that I just cited. Just as the editors celebrate a reclamation of trans monstrosity in the introduction to The Emergence of Trans, many genderqueer artists play with the imagery of the non-human, embracing and exploring the potentiality within these creatures that Toph Eklund called uncannily appealing. Most worthy of note, maybe, is two of the examples there on the screen. Steven Universe and She-Ra were both developed by non-binary creative leads, Rebecca Sugar and N.D. Stevenson, respectively. In the paper From Frankenstein to Genderpunk, Eklund catalogues many examples of lovable, mutated alien or robotic characters created through a very genderqueer lens, in spaces like independent game design. And as well as many examples, you also have collaborative blog sites like Fuck Yeah Monster NBs, which call for submissions of art involving, quote, genderqueer demons, gender-fluid shapeshifters, agender angels, demigirl harpies, trans non-binary lizard people, gender non-conforming centaurs, all of them and more come here to hang out. And many also acknowledge that while the recurring trope of the non-binary non-human is problematic in many ways, it's also a crucial avenue for non-binary representation. For instance, in some jurisdictions, alien or magical non-binary characters might skirt past censors concerned about more explicit depictions of queer content, particularly regarding media aimed at young people. Allowing a portrayal of non-binary identity to reach wider audiences and providing this vision of possibility, however magical it is, to audiences who would not have seen it at all otherwise. So the otherworldly non-binary character presents both a potential ideological dehumanization of non-binary identity and a playful space in which to trouble binary notions of gender and gendered bodies, potentially even a source of empowerment, in, again, following similar lines to that reclamation of things like trans monstrosity. Rather than accepting a binary of good representation in which non-human characters are strictly problematic and human ones are always progressive, I argue that the heart of the issue here is that only depicting non-binary characters as otherworldly beings might restrict the public perception of this group still struggling to be conceived of as persons, as people, as humans. While it is important to interrogate the issues with non-binary embodiment in older works such as The Left Hand of Darkness or Realm of the Elderlings, it would be ahistorical and counterintuitive to discuss these examples and their speculative gender play as negative non-binary representation. The solution is not to dismiss the more ambiguous or otherworldly portrayals, but to create new works to stand alongside them that increase the variety of non-binary identities, characterization, and imagery in the broader field of fiction. For instance, the increase in human non-binary characters, especially in fields such as young adult fiction, is beginning to counterbalance these cliché of non-binary gender only being possible in otherworldly settings and non-human bodies. All the novels on the screen here have non-binary protagonists, and they're all perfectly human. Some of them, like Lake Law or The Honeys, are genre works where these characters end up embroiled or entangled in the magical elements, but the characters themselves are still human. So arguably, in the field of YA, the non-human non-binary character is an underexplored narrative device, despite being noted as an overdone cliché in other media. There is room here to play with gender identity in a variety of fantastical, more escapist, more allegorical, maybe even more monstrous contexts. As I argue for the potential of this space, I want to argue for the importance of a spectrum and the importance of nuance when it comes to writing non-binary characters who exist in a fantasy context. When writers step into this creative space, they are carrying all that literary baggage with them and need to mitigate the potential issues that come with it. To demonstrate what I mean, I'm going to talk about 3 YA novels. One that makes a valiant effort but ultimately falls into problematic tropes and ideas about gender monstrosity, and 2 that I argue give us a more nuanced take that shows the value of combining gender identity with speculative elements. So for our first example, let's look to the depiction specifically of Loki in The Seafarer's Kiss, which is Julia Ember's Norse-inspired YA retelling of The Little Mermaid. Loki fills the sea witch role here and transforms the mermaid protagonist, putting a cruel twist on her request for legs by turning her lower half into an octopus. So Loki is textually non-binary, and this is coded with the use of they-them pronouns, and what Robin Dembroff described as a gender incomprehensibility, I'm going to borrow that phrasing here, generated by their shape-shifting. So when they first appear, they're described as, quote, slim and elegant, androgynous, with neither soft curves nor rippling muscle, and the narrator cannot decide, quote, if she's looking at a man or a woman. So Loki here fits a standard of visual androgyny and ambiguity that many note is something of a non-binary cliche in and of itself, which is a whole discussion for a different time, but certainly something to mention. The greater issue is that Ember's Loki, unambiguously cast as the freaky supernatural villain, is the only non-binary character in the cast. Loki's lies and mind games echo the associations between genderqueer and trans identity and deception, which is unfortunately amplified when the victim of their cruel deceit is a cisgender woman, forced into non-consensual body modification no less. Loki's gender ambiguity is interlinked with their transformation magic and thus the source of their villainy. While the problems that Loki's portrayal represent would not necessarily be erased or fixed with the inclusion of other non-binary or binary trans characters, populating the book with others would alleviate some issues by providing alternative versions of the identity. But since the only non-binary character is the otherworldly twisted villain that the cis protagonist must outwit, the only representation of non-binary personhood lies in this net of negative tropes. Consider by contrast a couple of other YA novels that have non-binary characters and fantasy elements. In Alison Evans' Euphoria Kids, the non-binary protagonist, Iris, grew out of a seed in their mother's garden rather than being conceived biologically. This grants them the ability to speak with fae and forest spirits, and Iris can also see their co-protagonist Babs even when she's cursed to be invisible. Examining Iris, it's not incorrect to draw those associations between non-binary gender and otherworldliness. They grew out of a seed in the garden. However, Iris's non-binary identity is never tied to their magical origin in a way that suggests cause and effect. Iris is not non-binary because of their connection to magic. Rather, the magic provides a non-normative space to explore and affirm their identity. For example, Iris first learns of non-binary possibility from a local dryad named Veda. The dryads don't have a concept of binary gender as humans do, nicely echoing the speculative genderqueerness of fictional groups like Le Guin's aliens. Iris asks Veda if Iris can also exist as neither a boy nor a girl, and the forest spirit says, of course. It's a sweet scene in which a marginalised young person gets validation from a supernatural creature, the promise that they aren't alone and that beings like them have always existed, even if they have sometimes existed outside the borders of normal human society. A lot of Euphoria Kids takes place in these borderlands, with enchanted forests and magic back gardens providing a magic-touched metaphor for the kinds of alternate safe spaces queer youth often seek out. So Iris and the Dryads provide an example where non-binary possibility is opened by the magical, but it's not universally associated with it. Otherworldly creatures outside the gender binary exist in the story world, but they're not the only depiction of non-binary identity in the novel, or the only place that Iris gets their information. So crucially here, Iris also encounters queer identity outside of the magical space, in the real world, I suppose. Babs is a trans girl and perfectly human, albeit under that invisibility spell, and the midpoint of the novel introduces a trans boy with absolutely no connection to magic at all. Each of the three youths have a different relationship to gender and are at a different stage in their gender explorations and transitions, and they represent a nice spectrum of binary, trans, and non-binary experience that does not leave the depiction anchored in any one character. The trio, and Iris's magical mentors, also form a spectrum playing with the potential intersections of genderqueerness and fantasy elements, while also avoiding anchoring non-binary identity to the fantastic. Similarly, in Hal Shreve's Out of Salem, we have a genderqueer protagonist Z, who begins the novel freshly reanimated as a zombie. However, their identity as a member of the living dead and an individual under the genderqueer umbrella are never connected. Early chapters establish that Z was exploring their identity before their death/reanimation. Thus, as with Iris, Z is not non-binary because they are otherworldly. It's something intrinsic to who they are as a person, and the exploration is just facilitated by the fantasy elements. While Z is the only textually non-binary character in the novel, Salem does feature several binary trans characters and other cis-queer characters cast as their friends and mentors, providing Z with a sense of solidarity. Now, Z's liminal state between life and death makes a quirky allegory for their in-between gender identity, and the body horror elements of their fraught relationship with their living corpse make for a gross but sympathetic exploration of dysphoria, an example of authors reclaiming the imagery of the trans monster and using it for self-expression and social commentary rather than for insult and for othering. In contrast to these safe magical spaces of Euphoria Kids, Shreve uses the fantasy elements of their world to explore the way certain groups are deemed as monstrous and dangerous social others, and how those monsters come together and form communities to keep each other safe. Again, Z's zombification has elements of queer metaphor, and Z being hunted by upstanding members of the community who want to destroy them holds a frightening metaphor for transphobia. But these speculative elements aren't stand-ins for the real things. Zombiness is not a metaphor for being queer. Z is queer. The fantasy aspects give the author a wider canvas to paint their story of gender exploration and social othering, allowing them to get into some gory nitty-gritties that they just wouldn't be able to look at in contemporary realism. So these examples build on the rich history of writers using speculative fiction to explore non-binary possibilities, asking speculative questions like, what would it be like to have a species that doesn't conceptualize gender in the same way? What it would be like to have a body that didn't fit into the sort of gendered norms and human norms? But they also draw on more contemporary sensibilities that call for non-binary representation anchored in humanity and realism. So these examples allow for reader identification with the supernatural, again, that escapism, or perhaps that catharsis of relating to a zombie and all the body horror as part of that. But they also allow for a more realistic reflection of contemporary, real-world non-binary experience. So in their magic-touched genderqueer characters, Hal Shreve and Alison Evans work to reclaim and evolve the idea of the non-binary non-human, paving an intriguing path forward for the future of non-binary YA. Again, these characters come into existence alongside a whole cast of human YA protagonists who identify and fall under the non-binary umbrella, and form a really interesting spectrum across a whole variety of experiences that I hope will only continue to increase as authors continue to play in this space. Including me, but I'm not here to talk about my manuscript today. You can ask me about that later. That is where I will wrap up today. Thank you for listening along. I will see you all, if you are there, in the Q&A session that will be recorded or live streamed later. Have a good rest of the conference and take care out there. It's a weird world of zombies and other monsters and creatures. So yes, take care of yourselves and I will catch you later.